What's up, YouTube? So we're at the end of the build process. Finally, it's taken a year and a half or so and 20 odd episodes of this series, but I've finally done it. I've got the Eaton MP45 Supercharger installed into the engine bay of the MX5. So what I want to do in this episode is do a little bit of a recap on the expenses that I've incurred along the way. Now, I want to make something very clear from the get-go here. This was a bone stock 1.8 VVT MX5 when I bought it and when I started this process over a year ago. I'm not the guy on Facebook that says, oh yeah, I supercharged my car for 200 quid, but I'm not going to tell you that it already had a standalone ECU in it, that it already had injectors or blah blah blah, whatever. No, this car was a bone stock 1.8 VVT MX5 when I started the build, and all the expenses I've incurred have been getting it from that state into what you see today, which is a supercharged MX5. So I'm looking at right here, I've got all the expenses that I've incurred during this process. I'm not going to go through this in detail now because it'll take me far too long. If you want to see it, I'll put it into some kind of document format and put a link to that in the video description so you can check it out that way. Or what I'd rather you did was go and check out my YouTube how to budget supercharge a Mazda MX5, because I've spent the last 12 months or so making this series, going through each individual process in great detail and documenting the expenses that go along with it as well. So you've got two options there: either click that link in the video description or check out the entire YouTube series that I've done right here on this YouTube channel. Okay, so at the end of last episode, if you saw it, if you didn't, I'll recap it. I finally got a belt on the supercharger and started the engine, and that pretty much marked the end of the build phase of this project. And at the end of that episode, my final expense was £1,857.20. I probably didn't include the pence in the episode, but behind the scenes I have been keeping a track of the pence as well, so that's what it ended up with: £1,857.20. Now what I want to do today is go through some of the parts that I've sold, because obviously as I've gone through this process I've removed stuff from the car, and behind the scenes I've been selling that, and I think it's only fair that I get to deduct that off my final expenditure. So I'm going to do this in as best order as I can. The first thing I sold was the alternator off this car. Now if you remember, back when I did the ME221 install, episode 7, 8, something like that, I had an issue with the ME221, sadly, where it would not regulate voltage from the alternator. So long story short, the workaround for that problem was to install an alternator off a Mark 1 MX5. So I had to go and source one of those alternators, take mine off, and then fit that. So I sold the original alternator that was on this car, and I sold that for £46. Now that wasn't the end of the alternator story, because when I bought the Mark 1 alternator I paid £20 for it, which I think was a bit of a bargain, and I went over to this guy's house because he was local, I think about 15 miles away, and I picked up the alternator and he gave me another part and he says, oh, this is part of the alternator, you're going to need that as well. And I looked at it and I thought, well, it doesn't look like it's part of the alternator, but fair enough, it's your car, you broke it, I'll take it. So when I got back and looked at this thing and figured out what it was, it turned out to be a oil pressure sender from a Mark 1 MX5, which actually is quite a sought after bit of kit, because in the Mark 1s the oil pressure gauge was actually an analog gauge. Surprise, surprise, you'd expect all gauges to be analog, but I'll get onto what the Mark 2 is like in a second. But this, in the Mark 1, it's an analog gauge, so when you've got low oil pressure the needle will be low, high oil pressure the needle will be high. You get the idea. What happens in the Mark 2 is it's basically just a glorified idiot light, so it doesn't matter what oil pressure you've got, as long as you've got some oil pressure the needle will read just above halfway, and then if you've got no oil pressure it'll drop to 0. It is basically, like I said, just a glorified idiot light. I've no idea why Mazda decided to change that and why they didn't do away with the gauge entirely and just put a light in like everyone else does, but they didn't. So what people like to do is, well, for this exact reason, is they like to swap a Mark 1 instrument cluster into the car, so they've got the proper analog oil pressure gauge. But of course, to do that you also need the oil pressure sender off a Mark 1. So I stuck this thing on eBay and it sold for £35, which was pretty good really. So I bought a Mark 1 alternator for £20, I sold the alternator off this for £46, and then I also sold a little piece of gubbins that came with the Mark 1 alternator for £35. So obviously all of that was done because of the issues I'd had with the ME221, and would I rather have just not had those issues in the first place? Yes, of course, but that actually put a little bit of silver lining around the cloud that was that voltage regulation issue. So that was that taken care of. The next thing I sold was the double din stereo out of the car, because you'll remember really early on in this series, I think it was episode 5, I removed that stereo to make way for the instrument panel. So that sold for £25. The next thing was, there was a water pump on the back of the Supercharger when I bought it, the Mini Cooper S water pump. Now obviously that was totally unneeded in the MX5, so I bunged that on eBay and sold that for £10. Then I sold the stock washer bottle reservoir and the pump out of this thing, because I performed the relocation of all that stuff into the scuttle of the MX5. So I sold the stock washer bottle and pump for £8. Not a lot, but better than nothing. I sold the stock radiator and fan out of the car, because obviously I replaced it with the alloy radiator with dual fans. So that sold for £35. There was the old intake system, the crossover pipe and the airbox, that sold for £20. The exhaust heat shield that I removed, because if you remember I wrapped the exhaust manifold in this car. The heat shield sold for £20. And then the last part, or parts that I sold off this car, were the purple injectors. Obviously when I took them out and replaced them with the RX-8 yellow injectors, they were sat on the bench not doing anything, so I sold those purple injectors for another £20. That took care of the part side of things. I'm actually also going to deduct the price, because early on in this build I bought a second throttle body for the car, because I had intended to run dual throttle bodies, and I may well do in the future, but because of the nature of the build and the budget side, I actually thought, you know what, to get the build done in a budget fashion, I'm actually just going to run one throttle body. So for now I'm going to deduct the price of that second throttle body, which was £10.49, and then in the future, if I do decide to upgrade to 2 throttle bodies, I'll document that process and put all the prices involved as well, so you can sort of make that decision as whether that's something you want to do or not. So like I said, that throttle body was £10.49, and I'm knocking that off as well. So with all the parts sold and what I've not used, that totaled £229.49. So I'm going to take that off my £1,857, and that leaves us with £1,627.71. So that's what it's cost me to get this car from a stock 1.8 VVT to a supercharged car. £1,627.71. Now obviously this is just a sort of guideline for what you could expect to pay. I mean, I did get a deal on the G19 kit, being an early adopter, and I did get a blow-off valve free, so you could argue it would be a little bit more expensive. But on the other hand, if you wanted to not wrap your exhaust manifold, you could save yourself 40 quid. If you didn't want to run an intercooler and just run a crossover pipe, you could save yourself 150 quid. So there's options. You know, this is just a sort of guideline price about what you could expect to pay if you do something similar to this. And I would say if you budgeted £2,000 to do something like this, you could quite capably get it done, as long as you were doing the work yourself. If you were paying someone to do the work, obviously costs are going to go up quite substantially, but if you budgeted £2,000 to get this job done, you could probably do it better than what I've done. You could afford to buy some new parts where I've skimped on second-hand parts. And the other thing that keeps blowing me away about this project is you could pick up a decent MX5. Don't pick up a rot box. You know, it's just not worth it. Budget, I'd say £1,250 to £1,750 for a decent solid MX5. You could throw another £2,000 at it, supercharge it, and then have a legitimately quick street car or perfectly capable track car that would surprise a lot of other stuff out there. I mean, for the money, So you're talking around £3,500 to £4,000 to buy a car and supercharge it. I don't know that you could do anything better than that anywhere. I mean, let me know in the comments if you think there's something you could achieve for cheaper than that and get the same results, because I don't think that you could, which makes this project quite brilliant, really. I mean, as I've gone along with it, I keep thinking about this as well, you know, with the Capri. If I wanted to buy a full-on race engine for the Capri, you'd pay £6,000, £7,000 for the engine alone, you know. So when you think, if you budget £4,000 to buy an entire car and supercharge it, it's a really good deal, honestly. I'd definitely consider it if you're into track days or you like rear-wheel drive, B-road blasters. I don't think you'll do much better. So that's where we are with it. Now, obviously, there is more to do. Namely, the next thing I need to do is get it tuned, which I have been speaking to a bloke who you've probably heard if you've spent any time in the MX5 community or forums, Alex Hickson. He is a well-known guru when it comes to remote tuning cars. I've contacted him. He's ready to do a remote tune on it, which I will be covering in detail, so you'll know what's involved in the remote tune process in the next episode. I'm quite busy for the next 2 weeks, so it's gonna most likely be after that, but I will document that in detail so you can see that process as well. So that is what is coming up in the next episode, and I will include that cost on top of this as well, just so you know the final cost of everything. So there we go. That about wraps up this episode, I think. Yeah, I don't think we've done so bad there. So see you in the next episode when we get this thing tuned.